And welcome back to 310 to Left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers and F-Series, America's best-selling truck for 48 years and the official truck of the Boston Red Sox. Your usual host, Tom Caron, continues to fight his way through the woods of Maine. And so until he returns looking like Grizzly Adams, we're going to be carrying on. I am Alex Spear of the Boston Globe, joined this week by the great Lou Merloni. Lou, how was your weekend and why was it better than the Red Sox weekend?
Well, it really wasn't because I had to, call those games. So that wasn't a ton of fun for me, especially the way some of those games went down. But Alex, I always try to enjoy life.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that, Lou. You are nothing if not an optimist. Actually, sometimes I mean you're a New Englander, so you've got a little strain of pessimism going to you.
Balance.
But balance. There you go. Very zen. Very zen. This was a hard weekend for the Red Sox, and it's
Yeah.
brutal to watch an injury like the one that Triston Casas suffered. Like, you think back to what it was like seeing Trevor Story going down with that shoulder injury when you know how hard he had worked to have a healthy season coming off of the season in 2023. How brutal was it to just see Triston Casas kind of crumple in that fashion? And like as a player, what are your immediate thoughts when you see a player go down like that?
Well, you feel for him, right? It's similar to what you saw with Story the year before, right? Because both of these guys, Story and Casas, the last few seasons have been cut short. Especially last year with Tristan missing 98 games because of the rib injury. So you look at it, and my first thought is like, God, these guys, they work so hard in the offseason to get their bodies right. They come to spring training, and everything's going to be different. They're going to put a healthy year together. And then, a month into the season, something like this happens. And my first thought is this guy knows exactly what's next. He knows that surgery is coming. He knows that PT is coming, right? To get the flexibility back and a range of motion. He knows that he's going to be there every single day to build strength now. He knows he's going to start running and jogging and walking and then maybe be able to hit off a tee and then maybe take ground ball. Like he knows the road ahead of him, and I know the road ahead of me. I dislocated my ankle and basically missed 2005. And it's to happen back to back years. Yeah, I just feel for the kid because obviously he got off to a tough start. Like I've been saying all year, like for this offense to really get going, you need Devers, you need Casas to kind of get involved here in this offense. Devers has gotten going. You like to think Casas would have turned the corner as well because they needed that power potential. And it's awful because it's just the season's over. And he can't do anything about it until next February when he shows up in camp. Really, opening day next year. There's nothing he can do but try to get ready for it.
Yeah, and you saw the look on his face, while he's sitting there on the ground, and it's just like you wonder, like it's heartbreaking to see when you have
Yeah.
that moment of revelation and awareness that that this has just been ripped away from you, and that it's going to be a very long time before you're able to
Hmm.
perform at your peak. And frankly, we cannot take for granted what the other side of a rehab looks like, right? Like this is we should be mindful that Triston Casas is, this is not the first time that he's had a significant lower body injury that served to interrupt his career. He had a high ankle sprain back in 2022 that probably pushed his big league debut down the road by a little bit because he was in a good spot, and then he hits the ground hard, right? Like this is there are guys who glide when they're moving, and obviously he's not one of them. And
Hmm.
the load that he carries in his lower half, the way that he generates force from the ground up on that massive frame, you really you wonder exactly what it looks like after a surgery to repair a ruptured patellar tendon, and how much and whether or not that's going to, how that affects his trajectory as a player moving forward.
Yeah, and you just mentioned like this type of injury, right? Like there's no way to predict the future. Like as Tristan Casas's mind is that he's going to rehab, he's going to come back, and he's going to show them that he's that same player, and he's going to win this job. But there's no guarantees in life. I've heard, some people make comments that we may never see him again. Like I'm not going to go there. Like we have no idea what could happen. But a year from now, things do change. Every single year, guys step up, moves are made, whatever it may be. So there's no guarantees to anything, and that's the biggest fear for a young player that's trying to consistently prove himself in this league, right? And this was supposed to be that year where I'm going to show everybody I can play 150, 55 games. And if I can do that, I'm going to put up my numbers. And it was cut short.
And it leaves the, and of course, there's a practical way of putting this. I think that everyone starts by looking at this from just a human perspective of like, this is injuries stink. And then of course you look at the roster implications for the Red Sox, right? Because they do, you talked about it. Triston Casas, what they were expecting from him in terms of providing, some serious juice in the middle, like somewhere in the middle to let's say somewhere in the 4 through 7 spots in the lineup, that's probably where he was going to slot. And if you were getting a guy with 25, 30 homer power, maybe more from those spots, then you have a lineup that looks very, very deep and really formidable. And they don't have that anymore. Which you have to think about the roster implications. So let's just get to it, Lou. Like, what's the most sensible in your mind? Obviously they make the move to call up Abraham Toro, who had been playing very well in Pawtucket, but he's more of a versatile utility guy. Slot him in, mix and match with Romy Gonzalez, move both of those guys around the infield. What's the Red Sox roster solution without Triston Casas?
To me, it's Rafael Devers. When this season started, you said your outfield's covered, right? Roman Anthony, something happens there, you got Roman Anthony. The infield's covered. Something happens there, Marcelo can play all three, and he showed that in camp. It was very impressive, the internal clock in which he played. Catcher was an area where you were like, oh boy, kind of surprised. They didn't go out and get a veteran guy behind Wong, but now maybe we're seeing why, right? Because they love Carlos Narvaez, but still the depth was tested early on. And the real where they didn't have an answer was first and third base in spring training, like first base, everyday guy. Maybe Marcelo can be at third base. And, to me, Devers is that guy, right? Like he always has been that guy. And we're going to get into, maybe why he wasn't and how it was handled in spring training. But to me, it's just Rafael Devers. I am not concerned at all moving a third baseman to first base. We try to generalize too much and say, well, if Rafael Devers can do it, or if Mookie can play short and second and right field and win a Gold Glove, then everybody can do it, right? Like we can't do that. Like there's individuals like Campbell, he's playing second base, he's playing center field. Okay, there's guys that can move around. But when it comes to profiling guys, like a guy at third base who is used to playing on the dirt, who's gotten ground balls ever since he was probably the age of 6 or 7 years old, who understands the game and how the infield play is worked, cutoffs from left, where he goes, like you can flip it around, and I think you take the element of not having to throw the baseball. He'll have to throw the ball to second base to turn twos. But for the most part, I feel like that's an easier transition. You got to be all in on it. It's not easy. You got to work at it. There's some footwork. There's some figuring out which balls to go to your right. There are some technical things that you need to work on, but I just think it's an easy transition. I mean, people have been calling for this for years. Like Rafael Devers, maybe get him off third, put him at first. Is he a DH? To me, first base is the first step. Just you couldn't do it this year because of Devers, but going from third to first and then eventually to DH, his boy Vlad Guerrero did the same thing.
It's super interesting, right? Like how the positional handling of Rafael Devers through his entire professional life is a really interesting one, because at the time that he signed out of the Dominican, there were a lot of people who said, love the bat, that's a first baseman. And Rafael Devers has fought like crazy. We talked about this in spring training, fought like crazy to be a third baseman. And the Red Sox wanted him to create that identity around being a third baseman. So they never had him take ground balls at any position other than third base in the minors, right? Like right now they're in an era where they're moving guys around a fair amount at their intervening at relatively early stages, whether you see it with a Campbell, you see it with a guy like Franklin Arias, who's probably their best defensive infielder right now in the minors. He's moving around to shortstop as well because they want to cultivate versatility, have guys understanding all the way up through the system. Okay, like your primary position is this, but in the future, you have a chance to influence the big league team in a number of ways. They never did that with Devers. Devers was always third base. And to his credit, did the work. He was a hard worker coming up through the minor league system in order to prove that he could be a third baseman. But that question always loomed through the minor leagues and still through the major leagues. Will he one day be a first baseman? So they were they were cautious this offseason, right? Like at a time when they were talking to Alex Bregman, at a time when they were talking to the Cardinals about the possibility of acquiring Nolan Arenado. And I truly believe that had they not signed Bregman, that Nolan Arenado would be their third baseman right now.
Yes.
They never they never discussed this with Rafi Devers over the course of the offseason. There was a lot of Rafael Devers is our third baseman right now, and if that's going to change, he's going to be the first one to think about it. How different? Like, let's rewind this. Should they have been staying in front of this? Because, as you said, first base isn't really an area of depth for the Red Sox organization, right? They were covered. They did have Mayer. They did have Campbell as guys who could help out elsewhere in the infield. They did have Roman Anthony for the outfield. Are you surprised that they didn't approach the whole Devers situation in the offseason differently in order to make sure that they might, was there another path where they could have had him ready to be a first baseman right now?
Well, I almost feel like they spent so much time trying to squash the story publicly with the comments, and what everybody said, that it actually made it a lot worse, right? Because I think Devers was hearing it as well. He's our third baseman. He's our third baseman. But, I think the conversation could have been, and it's all easy in hindsight, and I don't have to do it, right? So it's easy for me to say, but we need a right-handed bat. You know that. We need an impact right-handed bat in this lineup. You want us to improve. Look around. The really impact right-handed bats that we can acquire are both third basemen, and both of them are gold glovers in Bregman and Arenado. Yes, we are searching, and if we happen to pull the trigger, there may be a position change. We're going to ask you to change positions and sort of present it as a first base / DH. Like, we're going to start getting you some work at first base. Let's be honest, Triston has had some injury concerns in the past. So maybe there's a split. We're going to get you on the field at first. Maybe Triston will DH a few times. We're not taking gold off the field with Triston Casas. Like, not at all, right? The range is limited. He's working over there too to try to improve, and he's had a tough start defensively. So if that conversation was more of, you want us to improve, there isn't really an outfielder that we can go get. There isn't really a second baseman that we can go get. By the way, this kid Campbell's legit. There isn't a backup catcher or catcher that can change our lineup. The only guys that can change our lineup are third basemen, and I don't know if that would have helped at all, or at least start to soften the blow to get him thinking about it. But, and like I said, it's easy to say in hindsight, but they were pretty public that he was your third baseman. I think that led to a lot of him actually believing that.
Yeah, and it's and then in spring training they signed Bregman, right? And so then the conversation becomes focused around build the routine as a DH, and like Alex Cora, like there was a resistance to saying until the very end of spring training, this is going to be the situation. Rafi is solely the DH. There's not going to be third base in the mix, which that is also an interesting pivot. Now, I respect greatly the idea that you need as a DH to figure out what your routine is going to be. And I actually think that it was kind of helpful for Devers to go through the period of focusing extensively on just hitting, and having those like 10 at-bats a day on the backfields of the minor leagues, both because he hadn't been able to swing in the offseason because of the shoulder stuff that he was recovering from, right? So he needed to get at-bats, he needed to get swings in order to be able to just have that build-up. I also think that it was super helpful for him to have a ton of pitch tracking, and we've seen the benefits of that this season, right? Like the fact that he has the best, to me, this is the best he's ever been in terms of swing decisions, in terms of not chasing pitches outside of the zone, in terms of knowing what he's attacking. He's never been better. And so I think that there's a benefit that occurred as a result of the fact that his spring training was so heavily focused on the offensive side of things. At the same time, there early in spring training, maybe about a week or two. I'm trying to remember when I got there. I got there late February, and I talked to Devers shortly after that. And I said, what happens if Alex Cora approaches you and says, Rafi, we think that for the good of the team, it would be great if you could start taking ground balls at first base. And he said, I don't like to speculate in hypotheticals because, that hasn't happened. So I don't know what would happen, but he's my manager. I love him. We have a great relationship. And so we can have that conversation if he decides that he wants to have it. It feels to me, and Craig Breslow said this the other day, they've never had that conversation, right? Like they've just let him focus on building his routine as a DH.
Yeah.
And again, there's been huge benefit to that, right? Like Rafi Devers, since April 1st, has been one of the absolute elite studs at the plate in the game. I know that the surface numbers are very good, 900 plus OPS. The under the hood numbers, based on quality of contact and like accounting for loud outs, hasn't been as good. But where, so even assuming that you take the approach in the offseason of we're going to, we're not going to approach this. Was this a missed opportunity in spring training, or were they right to let him just focus on the DH routine without adding in a new position at that point?
Yeah, and I think he could have taken ground balls. You know what I mean, and still focused on DHing. We were talking about hitting in games, but hey, just come out here a little early and start taking some ground balls, get some work. I look at Rafi's spring training as saying, mentally he was all screwed up, right?
Mm-hmm.
They threw this on his lap. He wasn't willing to accept it. I don't know if you've heard some of the comments from Edgar Martinez talking about like how hard it was for him. He needed to first accept the fact that he was going to DH. And I think, excuse me, that was the hardest part. So, yes, he started getting at-bats in the backfield. I don't think they were truly focused at-bats. Okay? Like there's a difference between William Abreu,
Mm-hmm.
okay, in the backfield, grinding out 6, 7 at-bats, and Devers having 6 or 7 at-bats. He's doing it, but I don't think his mind was ever in it. I don't think his focus was ever in it. So when we talk about spring training, was he ready? I don't think so. I think that was obvious the first week, 10 days. Then he started to get into it, okay? But then it started to figure out a routine as a designated hitter in a regular season. And that is a lot harder than most people think. Like it turned into like he's moping, he's whatever it was. Like mentally, he dealt with some stuff in spring training. But the routine of DH is not an easy one. It's not for a guy that's used to grabbing the glove and refocusing and going out in the field. Swing at the first pitch, get out in front and pop it up and sit there for 2 innings and think about it. That's not for everybody. So he seems to be adapting to that. Now, in spring training, could he have taken ground balls with it? Yeah, I think he could have, but I think the whole situation was so sensitive and so messed up that you were just trying to get his mind right on one thing, and that is being a DH and trying to help this team and try to accept it and try to figure out how to accomplish it.
Yeah, it was interesting. You mentioned Edgar Martinez. I talked this weekend to Paul Molitor, who was part of the
Yeah.
Twins broadcast team and made the transition at a little bit of a later stage in his big league career to being DH. He was in his early 30s, but he said like didn't love it. Like I thought that I was still a really good athlete. I loved the part of the game of being in the field, but the Brewers decided at that point that that was what I was going to do. And so when he made the transition, he had dabbled in being a DH for on and off at different points in his career, but it was never full time. So at the beginning of the 1991 season, he spent 2 months basically being nothing but a DH. And then
Mm-hmm.
he started to be a DH first baseman, which was interesting because he had moved around the infield prior to that in mostly third base, second base prior to that. But then he said that he was learning during that time as he kind of learned as he was forging that DH routine. He also started doing some work at first base in order to add to the skill set. So it can be done.
Yeah.
It's not everyone. Not everyone has the same path to figuring these things out. But it is a very rich conversation. There's a lot going on with it, and so we'll continue it in a second. Right after this break, we'll continue talking about the first base question in Rafi Devers and on 310 to left. Back on 310 to left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. And Lou, as we talk about first base solutions, what, you want to get your first baseman's glove back out?
No, although I loved it. Back in 2004, I was with the Indians, and it was right at the end of camp. We had a first baseman, Benny Broussard, lefty, and Eric Wedge was the manager, and he was just like, hey, have you ever played first before? And I'm like, no, not really. And he's like, all right, you can handle it. We'll work with you. I'm like, okay. And listen, you talk about buy-in, right? There's obviously going to be buy-in for me because it gets me in the lineup. So whatever it was going to take, I was going to do it. And I did it, and it didn't, I don't know, a few days, a week, whatever. We went over some of the basics around the bag, the footwork, how to use the bag to your advantage, getting out there in certain throws. The biggest adjustment for me was, as an infielder, you are so used to going after every single ball that's hit that I had to realize I had to see where my second baseman was. I had to know which balls to my right to go for, which ones not to go for. Move your feet. But I was a utility infielder. I was an infielder. So I didn't have a problem with it. The one thing I did do actually was ask for like a smaller type first baseman's glove
Hmm.
because I didn't play one-handed a lot. You know what I mean? And I played two-handed up the middle and at third base. Like I always had my bare hand near that glove because I always wanted to quickly transition to get a grip on the baseball. So if I was going to catch this ball and throw it to second base for a double play, I wanted a little bit of a smaller end of a first baseman's glove to find the baseball in my glove to be able to make that throw. But the picks in the dirt, not a problem. You've been picking baseballs your whole life. I think when you play baseball, you realize that when there's a base hit to right field, you are the cutoff. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
center field, you are the cutoff. Like you pay attention to baseball. You're a baseball player. So there was some adjustments, but I felt like after a few weeks, like I was really comfortable over there and it was getting me in the lineup.
A few weeks was the rough timetable. Like you were able to get from drill work to into games
Yeah.
that quickly.
Yeah, it was actually I was in games before that.
Yeah.
Like I was in games. I'm saying a couple games of weeks, you know.
Yeah.
It is kind of funny because let's say you're a third baseman, it's a ground ball to second. You're ready for the ball, you see it to go to second, you sort of just stand up. Well, at first base, like the first message to your brain is they're throwing it to you. So you got to get your ass over to first, right? So the
Yeah.
difference now is with the shift. They're asking first basemen to play off the bag more, but that's an easy
Right.
fix. They even did it with Triston. Like he was getting too far off. Play closer to the bag until you get comfortable. You start getting comfortable, maybe you can slide off a little bit more. But like I said, Triston was doing it too. They got him closer. Like there was too many times on hard hit balls that sometimes Bregman or Story would throw to an empty base, and it caused some throwing issues early on. So they moved him closer. So a guy like Devers, inexperienced, you move him closer. And to be honest with you, every single person that they're thinking of moving over there is inexperienced. None of them really know what they're doing. They're figuring it out on the fly.
Well, so let's get into that a little bit more, right? Because like we've seen that being a real problem for the defense in prior seasons, right? Like the Frenchie Cordero experiment was not an elegant one. That did not take. That's an outfielder
No,
they tried to turn into a first baseman, and that did not work.
no.
For Devers specifically, based on his action, like I I talked to some people in spring training who have a pretty good history of with Devers, and they actually like they were not in Red Sox camp, but they were just looking at the situation from outside, and some of them were like, I think that Devers could be a really good first baseman
Yeah,
because he actually has, like when his setup is right, he actually has some good springiness, some good range at third base. He can move pretty well laterally, and the hands work right. Like the real issue with Devers in terms of where the clusters of errors happen is almost always with the throwing. Right, it's rarely been with the picking of the ball. There have been range questions associated with him in third base, but the demands on range at first base are different. And there were a lot of people who saw him as being a kind of springier, more lively athlete than Casas. Like some of the same things we're talking about that maybe played into the injury of him being kind of
yeah.
heavy and anchored into the ground a little bit. Like Devers is a bit lighter on his feet. So there were people from outside who thought that he had the kind of tools, the tools to make that transition. What do you see? Like, is there a risk of the kind of Frenchie Cordero scenario, or
Hmm.
Kyle Schwarber struggled at first base. We saw that as well. Yeah, what do you see in terms of Devers specifically as a potential first baseman?
See, that's the thing. You're talking about moving an outfielder to first base, and Kyle Schwarber really is a DH. Like he's not even a good
Mm-hmm.
outfielder. So when I think of Rafi Devers as a defensive player, right, and this is where I think some of his frustration came in. They asked him to improve defensively. He went from a guy that's made what 20 plus errors 3 years in a row, had 16 in a 2020 shortened season, almost a 30 pace. He had 19 errors in 23. He got it down to 12. And everybody keeps pointing out that yes, he led the league in errors for the whatever time. He made 12 errors last year. There was only four guys that actually qualified to play enough over there, and the others were Bregman and they were Ramirez, who made 9 and 10. So you're
Yeah.
talking about a guy that made more plays than he has in the past. as far as like lack of errors, the balls he could get to. Here's the
Mm-hmm.
thing with Rafi. Last year, he's minus 11, minus 8 in the field. He's a plus 1 on charging balls. He's a plus 2 to his right down the line, range wise. He's a minus 11 to his left.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he's a minus 8. He has no range to his left. That's where Bregman comes in. You see it already. He's getting balls that Devers can't.
Yeah.
So it's a range issue for him. He has good hands. The throwing issue is because he doesn't get his feet. They can get lazy at times, and they don't get him in a good position to throw the baseball. And because of that, he airmails a few balls. All right. The other part of it, too, is that he is a one handed third baseman, which I'm not a huge fan of. You have to play one handed on balls to your right, backhands, and balls to your left, forehands. You have to play one handed. Get your bare hand out of there. But balls that are right at you, you look at Bregman, that bare hand is always down there with him. It's a traditional, fundamentally sound fielding action. Okay. And what that does, number one, it keeps your shoulders square. Okay. If
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be a one handed guy, my shoulder leans forward. My shoulders aren't square. All right. So when my shoulders are square two-handed, I also happen to be able to get the baseball into my bare hand as soon as possible. And it's a shuffle and a throw. Too many times on routine ground balls, Rafi would play one-handed. The feet
Mm-hmm.
would move as he's trying to find the baseball. And the feet would move and the feet would shuffle. He doesn't have the ball. He's running out of time and he airmails it. When you go take that profile to first base, okay, we start talking about range to his right, where it's a plus, all right, in the
Mm-hmm.
hole. Range to his left down the line, that's his minus. Play him closer to the line. Okay, he plays one handed, which is what you do at first base. He's already got that. But the issue with one hand at third is you're not getting the ball in your bare hand enough. You're not
Right.
setting up your feet enough to throw the baseball. You don't have to do that at first. Okay, and a lot of the errors at third, when you do maybe come get it one handed and it hits off your heel and bobbles and drops right in front of you, by the time you pick it up, maybe there's panic, throw off the bag. Maybe you don't have time and the guy beats it out and that's an E5. At first, when that happens, you flip it to the pitcher. I think Rafi Devers would improve your team defensively. I think you'd be a better defensive first baseman than you've had there for the last 5 years. I think
Mm.
if he can accept it, because he's got hands, he can pick balls in the dirt. I know he says difficult and with the shift, you play him close to the first base. The cutoffs are different. They just flip the field around. From playing third, he knows a base hit to right, he's going to same cutoff like it would be at left field if he was at third base. Like he's got to work on the throws to second base. He's thrown his whole life. That's something he's got to work on. He's got to realize which balls to go to his right. But I think the skill set that he had at third base, the way he fielded that position, actually works better at first.
Super interesting. And I do want to point out as well that at least that in terms of the angle, that's different. But Devers does have some familiarity with the angle of balls from the right side of the infield because of his experience before the MLB rules changes entering the 2020 three season,
Yeah.
or 2024 season. He shifted, right? Like he played that rover position, so he moved over to the right side of the infield in order to in shifts. So he has seen the ball kind of from that direction. It would be more extreme, obviously, at first base than it was when he was kind of in that second base-ish position. But there is some prior history there. But obviously, there does need to be buy-in on his part, right? Like it is, I think that it feels like Alex Cora was very definitive this weekend, saying he's my DH. From my standpoint, this is not a delicate situation. He's my DH. Craig Breslow was a little bit more vague in discussing whether or not they would approach Rafi Devers to discuss the possibility of playing first base. He ruled out categorically the idea of having Roman Anthony or Marcelo Mayer there. He said,
Mm-hmm.
whereas with Devers, he said we're going to work through what our long-term options are. He didn't say that they would ask him. He didn't say that they wouldn't. How do you think that this plays out in the days to come? And is there an alternative? Is there someone else in the order? Like, again, they have Romy Gonzalez, they have Toro right now at first base. Do you think that if not Devers, then do you think that it's those two guys, assuming they go internal, or is there someone else that you think could also be part of a discussion?
I think what they did overnight was the right move, right? The question for me was, is it going to be Toro? You're going to add him to the roster, or is it going to be Sogard? But I think like somebody like Romy Gonzalez is very good, right? In his
Hmm.
role, he is very good. Like every utility player, including myself, wants an opportunity to play, show that they can play every single day, right? So I think for now, I think Romy Gonzalez, who by the way has a little bit of injury history too, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to run him into the ground. Like for
And who, by the
now,
way,
I
is
think.
relatively new at first base too.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
figuring it out too. The other day he almost got a little messed up on a ground ball up the middle. He thought it was going to get through, had to get back
Yep.
on that David Hamilton play. So he's figuring it out, just like Toro's trying to figure it out. Everybody, Vaughn Grissom's trying to figure it out. So I think short term they did the right thing. I know what they're saying publicly, and listen, I don't have any inside knowledge, whatever, but I'd like to think that there's a private conversation in the next couple of days. They sit down with Devers just to sort of feel where this thing is. I look at what happened up in Toronto, and again, I know we all know he's good friends with Vlad Guerrero Jr. If you think about if this was the scenario, because Toronto didn't really have much over there at first base, the way they could improve their ball club was to go sign a guy like Matt Chapman.
Hmm.
And I believe that's when Vlad moved over to first base. And it
Yep.
was, so now, yeah, at the beginning of the year, Casas was involved, okay? But now when you look at it, it's like, we really don't have an answer at first base. We have Alex Bregman at third. Like, this is a very similar move. There's a very similar acceptance of, you want the best team out in the field. I need you at first. We'd like to have you at first, however you want to phrase it, because then maybe I can get, Massa, MIA Massa, who might be able to still swing it with that shoulder, or just open it up for, say a Ref Schneider, a Massa Ref Schneider platoon, or whatever, however you want to work it, right? Like I just think it's easier to fill that hitter spot and play matchups and keep Rafi Devers in there every day at first base. So I like to think there's private conversations going on. I like to think that Rafi would just go in and be like, "Hey, let's try this," But I don't know. I don't want to speak for anybody. I don't know where his head is at, but I just feel like that. Think about it, Alex. When you're looking down on this field, this team from like 4,000 feet, isn't that the move? Like, wouldn't everybody think that that's the move?
Yeah, well, I mean, we saw like over the weekend. You probably saw the kind of social media clip of Massa throwing, Massa
Yeah, it
working to
didn't look good.
throw on the field, and like him wincing when he was trying to air it out and like shaking his head. So it does look like it's going to be a little while before outfield is a real consideration. Let's not forget too that when he last played the outfield when he was 2 years younger, it wasn't exactly great at that point. I realized that the Red Sox saw progress over the course of that season, but the bar was, the where that got to was still not an elite defensive outfielder by any stretch of the imagination, or even anywhere close to being an average one. So yeah, I think that it is a very interesting, if you've lost the bat of Casas, right? Like, if you have Rafi Devers at first base, then you have a faster path for getting Yoshida back onto the roster. Or you also create avenues where maybe they rotate the DH, in which case that makes it a little bit easier to consider call-ups at a certain point for the likes of Marcelo Mayer or Roman Anthony, in seeing them contribute in the lineup. But I think that as we think about these shufflings, we've identified Devers as someone whose skill set arguably looks like a
Yeah,
pretty good fit for this. And I having a conversation is not the same thing as saying you will do this. It's like, hey,
correct.
you still continue to take ground balls at third base. That's part of your routine. What if instead of taking the grounders at third base, where we've said you're not going to be playing this year, you tried some at first base and saw how that went? I don't know whether or not, and get his feedback. I think that that's kind of just have the conversation. I do wonder whether or not there is too much caution surrounding this, and if Devers wanted to play defense, right? That was part of the problem. So maybe he would actually be. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, whether or not he would be enthusiastic about the idea of having the possibility of defense put in front of him, or whether or not he would say, you know what, I'm good. I like where I'm at right now with my routine, but have
Yeah,
the
yeah,
conversation.
and you were bringing up a couple guys that he already shut down, right? Roman Anthony. All right.
Should they have shot them down?
Yes, yeah, Roman
Okay.
Anthony, 100%. Roman Anthony, 100%. I'll get to Marcelo in a minute, but Roman,
Yeah.
yes, because he's an outfielder. Like he's an outfielder. We already kept talking about it. Not every outfielder can play first base.
Yep.
I don't know whether he can or can't. You know what I mean? But he's never taken a ground ball. You keep a guy close at first base and the lefty's up. All right, that is a shock when the guy turns
Yeah.
and hits one to you when you're hopping off the base. I
Yep.
don't want anything to. I don't want this kid coming up as a rookie, the number one prospect, and not swinging it because he's a mess at first base, which he just learned. And here's the
Hmm.
other one. I also don't want him DHing. This is the other
Right.
thing. Everyone's like, bring Rafi at first and call up Anthony and have him DH. We're talking about Rafi Devers, like who's struggling to learn how to DH. You've heard from Paul Molitor. We've heard from Edgar Martinez. And you're going to bring up a rookie and you're going to sit there and say, all you get to do is hit something you've never done. You're 20 years old. Like that's out of the, I don't want anything to do with that either. Marcelo is a different animal to me.
Hmm.
If anybody is going to start getting some ground balls at AAA at first base, of these two guys, it would be Marcelo Mayer because this kid is Cali smooth. Would it be hard? Do I think they'll do it? No, because for the same reasons, But then again, there is a chance this kid's a shortstop and they're calling him up to play third or they're calling him up to play second, right?
Right.
I just
And
think
they've
internally.
introduced those to him more regularly this year for the first time, really, in his minor league career.
Right. So there are a few other options other than say the Toro, the Sogards, and the Romy Gonzalez's. I know that he shut down these rookies coming up and changing positions. I get it.
Yep.
But he didn't necessarily shut down current guys, right? And I know the big discussion here is sort of like the middle of the infield. Everybody's talking about Story. We're trying to figure out a way to get Marcelo up here. Campbell's in a transition. Another young kid that's learning second, that's learning center field. Do you just say, just learn first? I don't think there's gold over there at second, although I think he is getting better. I think is Marcelo a better defensive second baseman? Is Campbell a first baseman? We don't know. Like he's a guy kind of searching, right? We just love his bat. And I do think he's gotten a lot better at second base. And maybe it is too much to ask. And they probably say, no, we're not moving Ant Campbell. We're not moving Marcelo to first base at all. But if this Devers thing isn't the solution, I don't know what is. And that's where my mind starts drifting into guys like Campbell, guys like Mayer, things like that. Because quite frankly, the Mayer at shortstop, I don't know about you. I haven't seen too much of the kid. I still think Story's a better defensive shortstop. And I would
I
leave
think
him
that
there for now.
Yeah, I would my suspicion, and I don't know whether or not that plays out. Like prior to this year, I would have been confident that Story had more range than Meyer at shortstop. I do think that Marcelo is very smooth at that position and has a chance to be at least an average defensive shortstop, which is an incredible standard, by the way. Like people hear
Yeah,
average defender at shortstop, and they're like, "Yeah, is that all?" That's an incredible defensive player to
that's a
be
good defensive player.
the big leagues as a shortstop. But I think that my guess is that there's going to be a crossing of paths at some point, right? Because that's how age works. When you're Trevor Story, you'll lose some speed, you'll lose some range over time, and so at some point, Marcelo Mayer would probably be the superior defensive option at shortstop. But I don't know that we've arrived at that point yet. I know that Trevor Story's defensive metrics are down a little bit this year, but I think that that's based on a small sample that's a little bit misleading at this point. And I think that the Red Sox just value the metronome that Story provides at shortstop, right? Like I know that the infield defense overall hasn't been as good, hasn't been what the Red Sox or anyone expected it to be thus far this year, but Story is reliable. Their defense looked entirely different when he was at short in the last couple of years than when anyone else was there. And yeah, I think that there's probably going to be a reluctance to move him off the position, even though I think that he could probably move around, change positions as well, based on, we saw what happened when he moved to second base, no problem, and he was elite there.
Right.
But I think it's hard to take away the guy who you've identified as your best infield defender and move him off of that and hope that the other pieces work out while calling up a rookie who would still be getting used to the clock of the game in the big
Well,
leagues.
this is where this is where things get a little bit wacky, right? And I'll admit, I think Anthony is the wackiest, right? Because he's just
Yeah.
not an infielder. Um, and so they could be sitting there saying, "There's no chance in hell we're going to do this to Campbell. The kid's raking. That we're moving him around enough as it is." You know what I mean? And that
If I could,
scenario.
I
But
just want to jump in for 1 second there on Campbell. Like the interesting thing about Campbell is that they had no problem moving him all over the place last year and exposing him to different positions very suddenly and in response
Yeah.
to injuries, right? Marcelo gets injured. What happens? Kristian Campbell is suddenly a shortstop, and they actually were very impressed by what he was doing there. Now, I do think that there's concern this year about how that kind of compromised his development defensively at second base. But you do have that question of, is he going to be like, when you have Marcelo Mayer up in the big leagues, is what does your infield look like? Assuming that Trevor Story is still part of the team, what does your infield look like? So yeah, there is that interest. Like there were some evaluators this past offseason who were wondering whether or not Campbell would be able to handle first base, because obviously he has that bigger frame that you like to see as a
Yeah.
first baseman. And he has shown, we've heard so much about how quickly he learns, and that is a great attribute that he's featured. He's bounced around already to 5 different positions professionally, and he's still at less than 200 professional games, I think. So they
Well,
have not.
that's the
Yeah,
part of it that is intriguing. That um, listen, it's not nothing. None of this is a perfect scenario, and this is what happens when your
yeah,
starting first
yeah,
baseman goes down the end. At the end of May. So then you start having these conversations like, is this an option? Is this an option? Is that an option? And to me, it's like Devers is the option. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. Other than that, like Campbell, as you pointed out, is a guy that they have moved around a lot in his minor league career, albeit a short one. And if he's at first base, like, does that open up Marcelo coming up? Which then, just talking out loud, is kind of crazy, thinking that of the big three, the only one that isn't up here is the number one prospect in baseball. Right? Like, it's all, the whole thing is bizarre, but this is when you have injuries in certain spots, this is the discussions you have openly, and then things get shot down, you zero in on what your target may be. But like right now, I'm sort of wondering if it's Devers, Campbell, you know what I mean, long term. Because
hmm
I don't think outside the organization. I keep hearing Anthony Rizzo. Yeah, if you need a first baseman in July, bring him in now. Give him 6 weeks to get ready. He hasn't had camp. He's missed
right,
3 months. Like,
right.
I don't, and he wasn't. There's a reason why he's not signed in the first place. He wasn't exactly consistent. So you got to try to find something internally.
Yeah, the question of external is an interesting one, right? Like, if you want a plug and play solution, then it would have to be someone who presumably has already had a full spring training and has been
Yeah.
on someone else's roster, even a AAA roster. So you do wonder if, like, Dom Smith has an upward mobility clause, something like that would permit the Red Sox to go and sign him away from the Yankees, which is an interesting dynamic, just by virtue of being able to offer him a big league opportunity that might not exist in New York right now. But yeah, they're definitely in scramble mode, and yeah, there is that. It does feel like the cleanest roster solution is Devers, but that isn't necessarily, that doesn't mean that it's the right roster solution. And I respect the idea. Again, there needs to be, like, in order to figure out whether he's the best solution, then you need to have the conversation with him. And I think that's
Yeah.
probably that's probably where you're at as an organization. Obviously, this has been a major part of what's been going on with the Red Sox over the last couple of days. There has been more stuff to it, so we'll get into some of that when we come back after this break. And back on 310 to left, brought to you by your New England Ford dealers. So let's finish this up, Lou, by talking about the big picture of the team, because it's a strange team. They're 18 and
Yeah.
18 coming out of the off day. It feels like they should be better than that in terms of talent. Like, what do you see? How would you describe what you've seen through 36 games this season? Yeah, where is this team at, and where do you think it's heading?
It's funny. I was joking the other day. I think I even said it on TV that, like, I feel like this team is the only team in baseball that can be in the middle of a 7-game winning streak, but only go 4-3 during it. Be- because, like, I'm trying to figure out. I don't know if they're 18 and whatever it is, like, or 10-8 since that 16-1 drubbing down in Tampa. And
Yeah,
when you looked at what's happened since, right, with even losing a game to Chicago or the Cleveland series or up in Toronto, and then this past series, it's like, how are you 10-8? Like, I've watched every inning of this game, and there's been moments in this game where I'm like, nice, and a lot of it's recently where 3-1 lead in the fifth, 6-0 lead in the sixth. Like, you feel good, really good about half of a game or three-quarters of the game, whatever it is, only to lose it late or to not add on. And it's like a thing every day, right? Like, listen, I'm rolling Whitlock and Slayton out there the next time I have a
Mhm.
lead. I just am. Because it does come down to execution, and be able to execute pitches when the game is on the line. But I'm going to keep rolling them out there. But they have cost you 3 games. They were both part of the last one. And then it's just these little things. And part of the little things, Alex, to be honest with you, some of those things get hidden
Mhm.
if you score runs, like
Right.
if you add
Right.
on, if you're up 6-1, we're not talking about a line drive to David Hamilton off his glove, wondering, was it knuckling? Like what happened on that ball? Only to give up a 2-run homer. Like it's just, I don't know. It's like there's a lot of good things going on. And then you look up and you are what you are. You're 18-18. You're not that good. And your schedule really hasn't been that tough yet.
Well, the interesting thing,
Weird.
Lou, I think you're nailing it, right? Because like especially this past week when they blew a 6-run lead and then multiple 2-run leads that they had after 6 innings and lost those games, they've been ahead after 6 innings in 19 games this year. That's tied for the fourth most in baseball. The only teams that have more are the Yankees, the Mets, and the Cubs, and all of those teams have been, are in first place and they're rolling, right? They've lost 4 games when they've led after 6 innings. That's bad. They and the Diamondbacks are the only teams in baseball that are in that position. And so if you take if you take 2 of those and you're looking at right now a 20-16 team, then they're in a very different spot than they are right now as an 18-18 team. And in particular, there's not that feeling. And I agree. It's a little bit like the bullpen has contributed to it, right? Like they are not doing well in terms of high leverage situations in the seventh and eighth innings. And it's weird because they keep getting ahead 0-2, 1-2, and then giving something up. And seeing Whitlock walking the leadoff batter in an inning after getting ahead 0-2 is like, what is that? Like seeing Justin Slayton,
Yeah.
go from 0-2 against Vlad when it's swing and miss, and then get back to 3-2, and then have a curveball that he's not burying with first base open. Like that is the execution that Alex Cora is talking about. But they have struggled. Obviously, their bullpen struggled in those moments. But you're right; they're not adding on. They have a chance to put games away, and it's not happening because the offense is also kind of sputtering once they get through once they get that lead through 2/3 of the game, and it's a strange look for a
Yeah.
team.
You know, Before that Toronto 6-0 game, this team was 15-1 when leading after six.
Yeah,
And you were like, and people kept talking
changed
about the
quickly.
bullpen. Yeah, and I was just like, I'm like, well, that really hasn't been a factor this year. They're 15-1 when leading after six. I think since I uttered the words, they're now whatever. They lost those 3 games, and we're talking about leading the league in blown saves. You
Yeah,
know how hard it's really hard to lead the league in blown saves when your closer hasn't blown one yet.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
14-0 when leading after 8 innings right now. Yeah,
so it's like, and by the way, he's going to blow a couple too, right? They all do. And so now I feel like it's going to be devastating because he hasn't yet. But it's like getting the ball to him has been an issue. And it goes back to, and here's the thing with the Whitlock situation, right? Like, I do wonder, given that, whether, Hendricks, we'll see if he gets some leverage spots. I don't know. But the plan of like 2 innings, having 2 days off, I wonder if that gets altered. You're right. Because listen, he's been through a lot. You got to keep him on schedule. Okay. You have to keep him on schedule. And I get it early on. But will there be a point where they say, we can't afford to do this? Like, we can't afford to lose you for 2 games. And with the off days, as Alex said, they can maneuver this so he only misses one. But I wonder if the 2 innings at a time is going to actually hurt him, like as far as workload goes. Are you better having him available for back to back on days or 2 out of 3,
or
right? As
even
opposed
just
to
every
maybe
other
one
day.
out of three.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And
So
it will be.
until
Yeah,
they
we need
find
to
somebody
figure out.
else, and maybe Weisert's jumping into that. I don't know. We'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, well, Weissert did seem to. They extended him out past 30 pitches in his last outing. That's going to be interesting. You are eventually going to have a healthy Richard Fitz, and you're going to have Walker Buehler coming back. Do you consider Hunter Dobbins or Richard Fitz for a multi-inning leverage role, and then maybe consider Whitlock in a short role? I think that we're in a trial period, right? Like I think that
Yeah.
what we do know is that they haven't had it's magnified by one bad week. But there still seems to be a feeling out period for roles in the bullpen. So that's going to take
But
a little time to sort out.
this is the problem. It's been a tough 5 weeks, whatever how long it's been, right? So like one week, the relievers, you cough up 3. Earlier in the year we sat there and be like, wow, They've hit 100 this week with runners in scoring position, and it's the
Yeah.
reason why they've coughed up 3. And then one week maybe the starters, aren't going out there and they're putting you in tough spots. Like, this is baseball. It's just that it's been back to back to back to back to back, right? Like, reasons why you can't get going. Like, again, like I've watched the last week. I've seen the starting pitching. I'm trying to figure out how they're not 12-3 in their last 15. And that's just, I can't figure it out, right? Little
Yeah.
mistakes here, costing games, little mistakes there, costing games, and it's just different areas of this team costing them games. It's why you're a 500 club. I mean, it's what
Yeah.
you are.
Well, I think we can wrap up on this. So, I think that it's fair to say that I think it's fair to say that they haven't at any point yet fired on all cylinders. The question is whether or not going 500 is the floor, or whether or not this is more indicative of who they are. I think that's ultimately up to the players. That's ultimately up to the execution, right? I think that both you and I kind of are in agreement that this is a talented team, and now it's a question about performing to the level of the talent and dictating what the record becomes.
Yeah, it is a very talented team. We keep talking about these new players. But I do wonder if, like Core's always talking about, it's a very talented team. I got to trust them. I got to let them play. I got to let them do this and early on and everything. Like, we saw Duran, a guy with a resume, right,
Yeah.
walk Alex Bregman. You know what I mean? And I understand what Core was trying to build with Slayton with the Vlad Guerrero situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as talented as they are, I wonder if we forget how young they are still. Slayton year 2. Whitlock, not much time. You know what I mean? Like he's been injured a lot. Like, Casas was here, now he's not. You got Romy Gonzalez, you got Abreu, Rafaela, Narvaez, Wong is still young, Duran is still young. Like, it's still a young group that is talented, but it's just that they're not putting it together right now as a group, right? So I don't know. Maybe like reel some of these guys in a little bit and make them do what the hell you want them to do.
Well, one person who always puts it together exactly right, Lou Merloni. It's been great having you on 310 to Left to break this all down. No better person in the world to talk to about the Devers situation, I think, than you, and always great perspective on the team. So great to connect, Lou, and look forward to doing it again another time. But thanks to everyone for tuning into 310 to Left. And one day we'll even have Tom Caron back here.